Good morning. Continuing our review and summary of Ayin Beis' conclusion. We are on page 1459, end of the paragraph. And we learned that just like there's a Midbar B'Le'umazeh, meaning in the negative side, a parched, arid, thirsty land as a result of lack of Giluyim, lack of any revelation, in contrast to a civilized part of the earth or land, Eretz or Adama, even, but Eretz in general. There's also on Kedusha, Midbar de Kedusha. And what is that? That is the intense yearning and thirst with a overpowering, fiery passion in the nefesh, and specifically the nefesh alikis, in its longing for God, which is higher even than the Yeseda Eish of the Seraphim, of the angels, because it's rooted in a higher place. And he said, "Evim gam tzmeim nafsham b'hem tisatov," that there's hunger and there's thirst, but thirst is deeper even than hunger. He asked the question, "Begashmius, how could you have them both?" He says, "Beruchnis, they could be both. It's two levels of seeking. One is a hunger of lechem, and yesh avish b'chinsam b'teikif yesa, what he calls mesidus nefesh." And that's what that's the midbar of Kedusha, that mesidus nefesh. And he explained the connection to the fact that midbar does not allow things to grow. What is that in Kedusha? That's a level of rotze, where you're in a state of absorbing an elevation, rotze in halal, like he calls it, ein b'chinas shuv v'gili, not a state of expressing, of giving birth, of yielding fruit and producing. It's a state of elevating and being encompassed in the source. Even though that will ultimately generate a shuv, like he said, which we'll explain later. It's three pages later, we're going to learn about that. A second point, that my paid and mitzvahs are compared to fruit. But mitzvahs relate to the structure of existence. The 248 positive mitzvahs correspond to the 248 evarim de malka, the organs of the king. And here we're talking about a level that's higher than that, that's higher than structure. Midbar lo yashav adam sham. Higher than Adam, the structure of Adam. And finally, the final point he made was, and what brings one to such type of thirst in Kedusha? It's when you contemplate how all of existence, and even the highest Giluyim, even Eiris, the highest Eiris, are all like a Midbar Shmama. Like he brought the Pasuk, like the Lechu, Chazum Mefales Alakim. See the activities, the actions of God, how he brings desolation, Ashasham Shames Ba'aretz, Altik Shames Ela Shemes, that the Shemes, even the 7 holy names that you're not supposed to erase, compared to Atzmus, is like Gufa B'leinish Mas, like a body without a soul. And the body compared to the soul is completely insignificant. Ein Arech. Shmoy Sheila Kelim. And the same thing with the Eiris, and not just the energies that relate to the containers, but even the energies that are beyond the containers, like he brought from Kesed Elyon, even though it's a Eir, Kadmon, it's a primordial Eir, a high-level Eir, but Ukamhu, it's dark compared to the source. So when a person contemplates on that, then of course it's going to create a tremendous thirst to want to be absorbed in the source, not in the existence that you're involved with. Likol b'chinas atzmus ein sof, lo adamhu. Ata Kodesh, which is higher than Shimcha Kodesh. And that's the Shtaba Begufa de Malka, the expression he's been using, that comes davka from the thirst. And that's Midbar de Kedusha. What he didn't address is what brings one to this thirst. So he says now the contemplation. Earlier he said it's the distance, it's the neshama that comes down below. And now he's going to bring that into the picture in the next paragraph and connect it all. So let's continue. New paragraph on page 1459. Pages can be found at, if you want to follow the text, at ayinbeis.com. Umasharotze hanal mischadish ba'neshama dafke b'didosa lamata. This rotze, we know, where is it generated? More than that, mischadish means something that it's a new thrust, so to speak, of the neshama. Lamaila doesn't have that. So where does this level of thirst is mischadish? Is dafke b'didosa lamata. And what's the meaning? Why, as we learned before, that's when the neshama comes down lamata, it develops this. It elicits this level of thirst and semoyin and rotzeh. Ki hasibul zehu harichuk shemitzad hagufa nefesh habamis. Because the cause for this is the distance that comes due to the neshama coming down into the body and the animal soul that conceals the neshama. Shari bislapshu zeis misalim era neshama. Because through this islapshus of the divine soul, being enclosed and engaging with, manifesting within the body and the animal soul, it gets concealed there. Shabba ba'akshama, like we learned earlier on the top of the last page. Used exactly that word, ba ba'akshama, that the soul, though it's a sublime entity, and the higher you go, the more sublime it is. But as it comes down, it's not like Oir Hashemesh, like the light of the sun that does not get affected by where the light shines. Here, the neshama is Beislapshus Primi, because the Oir Hashemesh is only a makif. So the light shines everywhere, and the light does not become more coarse or crass, or in any way thickened or congealed or solidified as a result where it shines. But the Oir Neshama is a Oir Primi. As the Oir Primi, it engages with the body and the animal, so it becomes b'akshama. It doesn't become the body, but it definitely affects the neshama to become b'akshama. Commission is bar il become a duchtin, as was explained earlier in a number of discourses. She'ena me'ira klal k'moshe me'ira l'maylo, should say l'maylo, that it does not radiate below at all the way it radiates above, the neshama that is. And furthermore, ve'ein adam tzadik ba'aretz v'lo yechta. The pasuk says, "Ein tzadik ba'aretz asher yasa teva lo yechta." So he's quoting that. There's no tzaddik, even a tzaddik in this earth, that doesn't have some form of yechta. What's yechta? So usually we define that as sin. V'lo yechta chet hu loshech son. Because how could you say a chet on a tzaddik, especially a tzaddik, as he explains in Tanya? So the word chet also comes from the word lacking. So there could be a chet, a full-blown chet is a sin, an actual transgression. By a tzaddik, you can't say transgression, but it's definitely something lacking. Classic example is Moshe Rabbeinu, that he was able to achieve 49 gates of understanding, Memtesh Shari Bina, and only the 50th gate, only when he came to Har Nevoi upon the last day, but when he was passing to the next world. That's even Moshe. Because in this world, no matter how high a tzaddik is, it's still not complete. We're talking about before the Gula, obviously. So it's lo yechta here, chet loshech son. All this is due to the Yeridas HaNeshama Beguf, so he's demonstrating here that everybody is affected by this Yerida. And even though earlier we learned that Neshama of Atzilus, like Moshe, as he is down on earth, he's Atzilus, but he's still down on earth. He still was impacted and involved with the. Not that he didn't become a neshama of biyah, and he did not assume the properties of biyah, but there's still an effect. And as such, there's this slapshus of the neshama lamato. Kamei v'hayisi ani ubnei shleim chatoim, pirish chasedim. This is a classic proof that Chassidus brings that chet is lashach sodden, because it says ani ubnei shleima. David HaMelech said, "Me and my son Shleima chatoim." And the commentaries say, what is he saying? That we sinned? He says, chasedim. We're lacking. From the word chaser. So what chsaden are we talking about? The chsaden, that the Gilead and Neshama, when it doesn't have a body and an animal soul to deal with, and it doesn't come down below, it's much more revealed. We learned that also earlier. He spoke back on page 1455. He also mentioned that from Tanya, that a person below cannot come, even a tzaddik doesn't come to the dveikus l'mayla. And he actually seichen there, L'kut Torah by Midbar Sinai, I see. Okay. So, all this to demonstrate that when the neshama comes down below, its energy, its divine revelation gets concealed. V'gam chsodin, so that's one level of chsodin. That simply gets concealed because it's now coming into a body and an animal. So v'gam chsodin mahalomis hanefesh habamis. So remember, we spoke with like two levels. He spoke. The mere fact that it comes down to this world is already a concealment. But then there's a concealment from the activities of the animal soul. The animal soul wants things, and its desires. Here, probably he's not talking about the tzaddik. He's talking about the rest of the neshamas. But maybe relatively speaking, that's what I would say. So he says, "V'gam chsodin ma'alomis hanefesh habamis." And there's also the chsodin. Well, from the actual flow, it sounds like he's talking about the tzaddik too, chsodin. But let's see how he explains it. From the haloma of the concealment of the animal soul, shari muchrach hu linyoni haguf. Yeah, I would say he's talking about everybody, because when the soul comes down below, it needs inyoni haguf. It needs physical things from the body. It needs to eat, to sleep, to drink. Even a tzaddik is dependent on that. Shazem ma'ilum u'mastir. And that adds to the concealment and the covering. So I correct myself. He's talking about everyone here. So that's also true about a tzaddik. Ubefrat. Here maybe he's already talking not just a tzaddik. He says, Ubefrat. Kishenimshach achrin yoni haguf. And especially when he's drawn to physical matters, the bodily matters, I should say. Afilu binyonim dakim. Even very subtle ones. Meaning it's not necessarily indulging like in the full sense of the word, but even the fact that something bodily draws him, attracts him. And we're not talking about necessarily anything prohibited. That itself also adds into the concealment. Bottom line is that neshama without a guf is unfettered, doesn't have any of the effects of this physical world. U'kamoy that's the guf and nefesh habamis. But there's also another helam, the helam of existence, the world. U'kamoy kain b'chinas hahester b'chlal de'elam hatachten. There's the fact that he's present now in a physical world. So there's the overall concealment of the slowest, of the elam hatachten, of the lower world. She'ein meir b'gilei elokus. A world where the elokus is not radiating. So in addition to the guf and nefesh habamis, the very world is one that is not a world of gilui elokus like in higher worlds. So there is concealment in this world, and the world itself. In some places it says elam aloshin helam. The world itself is a concealer on the divine. So all this sets the stage that when neshama comes down below, and now it's manifest within a body and an animal soul, all the details he just spelled out, and in a world that also conceals the zeu ascholas sibus harotze ma'arichuk, and this is the beginning that when a neshama feels this, becomes aware of its distance, this is the cause for the rotze, for its yearning and longing to get to a place that's not concealed. Ma'arichuk, the longing from this distance, the elam hatachten va'aguf v'nefesh habamis of this lowest world, and the body and animal soul, shaloi tev le ma'ed mizeh. He's not happy with this. It's not. Doesn't make him feel. It's a negative feeling about it. Shaloi tev le ma'ed. He's very unhappy about it. It literally means it's not. It doesn't feel good about it. It really feels bad about it. Shubamokim harichuk, that he finds himself in a distant place. It's like a person suddenly is traveling through a desert, and they suddenly realize, I'm completely lost. I'm completely in a place that's not close to my home, not close to a place where there's any water, where there's any sustenance. So he recognizes Mokem Arichuk in a distant place, Eres Sia V'Shmama. So now he uses Shmama, like he said before, a desolate, Sia, a arid or parched or dry, desolate place, She'en Be'Gilei Elokus, that has no divine revelation, V'Agufa Nefesh Habam is Ma'alimim Mastirim. And the body and animal soul are concealing and covering up on Elokus. So you can imagine that creates a tremendous, I would say even the word distress to the neshama, which in turn causes a ratzeh, a deep thirst. And now he's saying this. This is a very important transition here. Because before, when he said this in the beginning, it made sense. But then he added a whole piece. Remember what we learned yesterday? That when you contemplate how all of existence, even the Shemus, even God's names, and even the highest levels of Eretz and Gloom compared to Atzmus are also desolate. So you would think, one second, you could contemplate on that even in Gan Eden, even Elam Esalyenim. So he's saying, no. The reason most likely is, I'm speculating, but this is how I would explain it, because there you're satisfied. Yes, of course a neshama understands, even in Gan Eden, that the Eibush is higher. But bottom line is you're swimming in the waters of Elokus. You're Neman Miziv Ashchina. A person is satisfied. When you are not thirsty because you're drinking the divine waters, you're not going to start talking about thirst. However, in this world, it first starts with a negative. The fact that you realize that you're so distant from godliness because there's no revelation altogether. Not only no revelation from the highest levels, the revelation even of a neshama l'mayla you don't have. So he said that's why he calls it the hascholas sibus haratze. That's the beginning of the cause for the ratze. But that leads him now to realize the next step, and here he's combining both elements together, which is interesting. Comes to realize that really also the higher worlds, they're also distant and desolate compared to Atzmus. That's what he's going to add now. By Dezeb, now that he's realizing how distant he is, in a very literal sense, because of the thirst, actually from the Midbar you could say of the Umazeh. That brings him Shegama Elam Esalyenim to an understanding that also the higher worlds, Heim Be'emes Bebechinas Tzia V'Shmama L'Gaba Atzmus Canal, are in truth also in an arid and desolate state when you compare them to Atzmus. So when you're in those higher worlds, you don't feel that. It's actually like the vart of the Baal Shem Tov, Tzama L'cha Nafshi, Kama L'cha Be'eretz Tzia V'Oyev Bli Moyim. You feel that thirst because you're in a desert, where there's no water. Then he says, Kain Ba'Kodesh Chazisicha. So the Baal Shem Tov asks, what is the Kain? You just spoke about a thirst. Kain Ba'Kodesh, so too in holiness, Chazisicha, I will see you, I will gaze at you. So the Baal Shem Tov teaches Halavai. Halavai Ba'Kodesh Chazisicha. May it be the same way I experience thirst and longing in the desert, when I have no water, that when I see Kodesh, I should also experience the same passion. Because when you're in the waters and you're satisfied and you feel sated, then you don't have the same level of tzamayim. So what he's saying here is that first it begins with recognizing how far you are because of the lack of giluyim. Then that brings you to understand that also Elam Esalyenim are also in a level of shemama. That's what he's saying here. Now you could ask the question, what's mukhrach to say it that way? Well, firstly, as I said, this type of awareness of distance is only when you feel distant. When you don't feel distant, like someone who's living in the palace of the king is not going to necessarily come to this type of understanding because he's in the presence of the king and he's benefiting from it. It's only someone that's distant and suddenly realizes, really, everything is distant, if you come to think of it. But he's going to add more to this in the next section, what I mentioned yesterday about Ein Arech Lecha B'Elam Haza. So that's the first piece that he says here. how we come to this rotze is by coming down below, feeling the distance, because there's no Gilead Lakuz due to the guf and the body, the animal soul, the world itself. And that brings him, that's the beginning of the rotze, and that brings him to understand that all the elements, the higher worlds as well, are also relative to Atzmus in the state of Shmama. He said before, Shamis, a state of desolation. Any questions before I continue? Okay. I remember a number of times when the Rebbe spoke about the Russian Jews, when they were coming out, they began slowly trickling out of Russia, Soviet Union in the early 60s. After being in Argolis, in a prison, they were not allowed out. So there was the first so-called Chabad Chassidim that came out of Russia, was my parents and grandparents. That was after World War II, in the late 40s, early 50s. But then they closed the doors and no one could leave. In the early 60s, a few Chassidim began to leave, and later in the early 70s, when the big exodus happened, that's when over 1 million Russian Jews moved to Israel, many came to America, and so on. So the Rebbe spoke about this. Every major Farbrengen, he would talk about the Russian Jews who are in Machere Moscha Basel, as he would call it, behind the Iron Curtain in their prison, and in a state of Mesiras Nefesh, because they were constantly being persecuted for being Jewish. And even when they applied for a visa, that caused even more persecution. They were in constant threat. The Rebbe spoke a number of times that when they came out to America or to free countries, they lost that Mesiras Nefesh element. Because now you're living in a comfortable country. He wasn't being critical per se of them, but of the situation. When you're living under such pressure, you have no choice, and you're struggling every second to be Jewish. Everything is with a rotze. They had the tremendous thirst and yearning to see the Rebbe, to come out, to be able to live like Jews, to be able to educate their children easily. Once it became easy, that edge, and the Rebbe was like lamenting the fact that the human nature is such. So not, God forbid, to return to a place like that, but how do you recreate that halavai b'kodesh chazisicha? How do you recreate the same level of passion and thirst when you're not thirsty? When you have water, and you can send your children to school, and you don't have to worry who's following you, whether they're looking at you when you go to shul, or performing mitzvahs, or wearing a yarmulke, and so on, or not coming to work on Shabbos. So all that was like a certain loss of that type of level of Mesiras Nefesh. And I heard it myself from quite a few that felt that level of urgency, which is a topic we've talked about many times, comfort creates apathy. Just giving a practical example of what we're talking about. However, when you do feel that distance, like he says, that then leads you to understand that everything is distant from Atzmus, as we just finished learning. Just wanted to add a little explanation. Now he's going to say another explanation for this phenomenon. Why Dafke Ne'elam Hazeh, we also come to understand how Atzmus is completely, so in a, you can say almost in an ironic and paradoxical way, the distance is what gives you an awareness of a level of Elikuz that you can never have experienced when you're close. Because close, you experience the closeness. Oir is constantly aware of its source. It reflects its source. It's only darkness that can teach you to appreciate that the source is beyond everything, which is what real Atzmus is. So that's where he's going to continue now. He says like this. V'gam yesh lemer, we could also say, Kamoshin is bar le'il, like we learned earlier, as it was explained earlier, and I'll tell you the pages, 14, 42, and 43. So it was around 15 pages back. The ein arech lecha, when we say on Shabbos in Shach, ein arech lecha ba'elam hazeh, that ein arech is infinitely distant. Where? Ba'elam hazeh. The other expressions, efes biltecha, ein zulosecha, And the final one, F is Biltecha Enzel Lesecha. What's the F is Biltecha Enzel Lesecha? There's one more. Ein Dei Melecha. Those are on different levels, but Ein Areich is Dafke Be'elam Haza. Be'elam Haza Dafke. The Mitzias Yesh, because it's only in Elam Haza where you have the Mitzias of the Yesh. This entity that is a self-contained entity that does not feel it has a source. Elam Haba, Gan Eden, the higher worlds, they all sense there's a source. Question is how much they sense. So in Atzilus, it's complete Bittul Mitzias. But even in Bria and Yetzirah, there is an element of awareness of godliness. The Malachim sense it, the Neshama sense it there. But Mitzias Yesh, when you see a Yesh, and a Yesh that does not indicate that it's coming from somewhere, that tells you that it's B'derech Ein Arech, like he explained there, that it's Yesh Ma'ayin, that's coming from a place that's completely beyond the Yesh. When you see, for example, Yesh Mi Yesh, here you have, let's say, a barrel of water, and from there you're pouring water into pitchers, and from pitchers into cups. There, you don't need to say it's Ein Arech. It's not Ein Arech. The water has a source, the source has another source, and you could trace it all. But when you see a Yesh, you say, where did this Yesh come from? You have to say that where it came from is something that's completely beyond the Yesh, a different reality. That's why it's called Ayin. Ein Arech. And we learn there, and that teaches us on the Yedim, Shegama Eru B'derech Ein Arech. So that also Eir is in truth infinitely distant, because God is just as distant from Eir as he is from Cheshach and darkness and from the Yesh. But who teaches that to you? Only when you see it in the Yesh, only in Elam Haza. Now, why it's a Gam Yesh Lemer needs to be understood. Seemingly, you could say this explains what we just said about the Rotze, that you come to realize that all of existence is Shmama compared to Atzmus. But clearly, you could say that even without this Ein Arech Lecha. You could say once you feel the distance, you come to realize that everything is distant. Here he's adding that the Elam Hazeh, the Yesh, compels us to understand the Ein Arech of Atzmus. Then you realize that Atzmus is also Ein Arech, infinitely distant from Eir. Ukameshin is Bar Le'il. All this explained earlier, as I said, back on page 1442 and 1443, if you want to look it up. And this is, now he concludes what he began at the beginning of the paragraph. And this is the contemplation and the understanding, the above described understanding and contemplation. This is what is innovated. Dafka lamata. Dafka with the neshama comes down below. Above it does not experience this. Above, where it's not a state of Yesha Mitzias. There is a state of existence, there's a Bria, but it's not a Yesha Mitzias that just is a self-contained and in a sense senses that it's just me. In the higher worlds, you don't feel how it's Ein Arech. Because there, on the contrary, you actually feel that God is commensurate to you. Godliness is your source. You feel the energy coming from there. Here you don't feel the energy, so you have to say that it's Ein Arech. Which is an interesting twist in general. Usually you would say, when you don't feel the source, that's the reason they're atheists. That's why there are people who deny that God exists. Chassidus comes and turns it around and says the fact that that something was created that doesn't feel God tells you that God is completely beyond existence. It's interesting because there's an expression that Rebbe Rashab once said. For many years, this was not publicized. But today, I guess you could say it. Rebbe Rashab said that in a certain way, an atheist, a kafir, what's called in Hebrew, a kafir, a apostate, someone who doesn't believe in God's existence, is closer to the truth than a believer. And the reason for that is this. When a believer says God exists, what does he mean? He means God exists like I exist. But he's God. But his existence is in the same realm as our existence. When an atheist says God doesn't exist, the Rebbe Rashab is explaining, yes, he doesn't exist like we exist. That's why he's denying it. because he only believes in existence like our existence. So saying that God doesn't exist means, yes, he doesn't exist like we exist, like a built mitzias nimtza, a non-existential existence. So even though it's not what they mean, but the mere fact that they sense that, they're sensing that God is a completely different reality than us. That's why when you have people say, you tell me that God must exist, why? Because nothing creates itself. A book it cannot author itself. A piece of art has to have an artist. A composition of music must have a composer. You see a building, no one's going to say the building built itself. So when you look at the exquisite universe, simply put, it's more elegant and more designed than all books and music and art and so on. So ein dover eises atzmi, nothing creates itself. That indicates there's a creator. So the first question you always hear, or often hear, from the denier, so but then who created God? The same logic. But the answer is, if God is God, God is not like us. You can say that only in our existence. You can say our existence is an existence, and therefore something had to put it there. God is a mitzias, built a mitzias, nimtza mitziusim atzmusei, as the Alter Rebbe calls it in the Geras HaKedesh 20, section 20. And that means his existence is a reality because it's real. That's why it exists, not because someone put it there. But that tells you that God's existence is completely unlike ours, which is the key element here. Because once you make God exist like we exist, then all the questions you apply to us, you can apply it to God. That's what the Rebbe Rashab, what I elaborated, he only said the word that the non-believer, when he says God doesn't exist, has a certain, in his statement, there's a certain deeper truth than when we say God exists, because we're talking about existence on our terms. Just adding to the whole discussion here. So anyway, this is bonus sheneschadish lamata, because lamayla ain't a nirgish. Lamayla, with it's not a yeshem, it sees you don't sense this ein arech, this absolute infinite distance, because there, on the contrary, you relate to God. So, like I have chesed, my chesed comes from God's chesed, for example. And the Rebbe Shab is going to add more to this. But I want to go slowly here because it's a pretty profound topic. So again, anyone wants to ask anything before I continue? Now the Rebbe Rashab goes even further. That's the Eilim Misalyenim. Now he's going to talk about Atzilus. The Yesh Lemer, I'm talking the last words on this page, 1459. We're going to 1460. Yeah. Yesh Lemer de Atzilus, next page. We can say that in Atzilus, Ein Shaykh in Ein Arech. Here he's going even more. It's not Shaykh Ein Arech. The concept of infinite distance, not Shaykh in Atzilus. On the contrary, Sharihu b'chinas Gilia Helema Erein Sof Hamaitzel. Atzilus, its very name tells you that it was an emanation. It's not a creation. So emanation is Gilia Helam. It's revealing the concealed, that which is concealed in Erein Sof Hamaitzel, in the emanator. That's what Atzilus is. Creation, when we say Bria, Nivra, that's a Bria Yesh Ma'ayin. Atzilus is called Gilia Helam. The truth is, Atzilus is also Yesh Ma'ayin. But Atzilus itself does not know that until you come into Elam Hazeh. We learned this also, I don't know if any of you would remember, all the way in the beginning of Ayin Beis. I'm talking about literally chapter 6 or 7. We started speaking as Atzilus, Gilia Helam, or Yesh Ma'ayin. So Atzilus on its own is a world of Elokus. The Oves, Hein Hein Amarkava. They're a vehicle to Elokus and Atzilus. Chesed, Avram is Chesed, Yitzchak is Gvura. Moshe, even a higher level. If you spoke to them right now, all they can talk to you is about Elokus. I am a vehicle for godliness in this world. They're revealing godliness in everything they do, 24/7. The idea of Ein Arech is not relevant to them. Now, of course, they were intelligent people, so I'm sure if you ask them, they say, of course, Atzmus is Ein Arech, but not in their experience. Their experience is all about expressing godliness. Or as it sometimes says, that Gilead Helam, because it's revealing the 10 hidden spheres are coming out in a revealed way in Atzilus. Because in Atzilus, the Oyer, which is the revelation, the divine consciousness, is in the form of Dveikus b'Mekere. It's connected and attached and bound to its source, like sunlight and the sun. Sunlight can't talk to you about the Ein Arech of the sun. It could talk to you about, I am revealing what the sun is shining through me, which is the light of the sun. So there you say Ein Zulasecha, there's no other. Not Ein Arech. Zulasecha means, Zulas means another, there's no other. Because Atzilus feels that there's nothing else but Elikus. But Ein Arech, that the infinite distance of Elikus, that's only in the Yesh that experiences that infinite distance. That's the Oiris of Atzilus. V'gam b'chinas ha-kelim. And also the kelim of Atzilus, Harihem b'chinas Atzilus, are also called Atzilus. Iyu v'chayu ichad, that goes on the Oir. Iyu v'garmu ichad, that goes on the kelim. So the kelim, which is already the structure of Atzilus, you can even say the identity of the 10 spheres, is also a Lakus. But now comes an important qualification. Doesn't Atzilus also know that it's Ein Arech? Because v'hagam shenemar v'achochme ma'ayin timotze. It's all from the early parts of Ayin Beis, the early, literally beginning of volume 1. So this expression, Chochma, comes from Ayin. So Chassidus explains, what does that mean? Because Chochma senses that it's Yesh Ma'ayin from Keser. The conscious is like an Ayin. Where did the idea come? When you think of an idea, falls into your head. Flash of an idea. You can't trace it, like I said before, like a cup of water coming from a pitcher of water. There is an element of Ayin. That's not Gilead Helam. Says the Rebbe Rashav, nevertheless, Ein Ze B'chinas Yesh Ma'ayin Mamish. It's not Yesh Ma'ayin Mamish like Bria Yesh HaMetzias of this world. Ki mal derech meivin dover meteich dover. Commotion is bar le'il. It's more like understanding one thing, from that you can extrapolate another thing. In other words, it's true, it's a leap. Bina from Chachma, you don't say Ma'ayin. Chachma is a spark of an idea. Bina fleshes it out. Bina recognizes the idea, and they have a certain commensurate relationship. But Chachma, from higher than Chachma, there's an element of a leap, but you can't call Yesh Ma'ayin as a completely different reality. So it's Mevin Dover, Meteich Dover. It's like you can extrapolate and say, this idea that just came into my conscious mind in Chachma, that I just conceived of, has a source, but that source is hidden. It doesn't spell it all out here, but that's what it says. Where commission is bar leil, I have to find it. I remember it. I don't remember where it is. To do a little searching for that. Anyway, bottom line, all this comes to lead to one thing. That the true element of distance, of recognizing all of existence is a shmama, is a midbar, and therefore the true thirst is only in this world, not Atzilus. That thirst is not as profound, because Atzilus experiences godliness, basically. And even Chachma, we're not going to say it doesn't have some yearning to connect to that which is higher than it, Ma'ayin Timotza, but it's not Yesh Ma'ayin Mamish. So Hari B'Atzilus B'chlal, so he sums up now. So in general, in Atzilus, Ein Shayach HaSoged Ein Arech. You don't have the comprehension of an infinitely distant experience, where you sense distance. Rak Lamata Dafke Hu HaSoged Hazois. Only in this world below do you have this comprehension, because in this world you actually do not feel any elikus altogether. And as a result, you also sense ve'ech shegama eru be'ein arech. And as a result of that, we also come to how also is really be'ein arech. So in other words, this world reveals something that Atzilus itself is not so aware of, or not aware of, and the higher worlds are not aware of. That you are all ein arech compared to Atzmus. This is experienced only in a world of a midbar that senses this absolute distance and darkness, if you wish. Valkain dafke. Now he goes back to the original point, and that's why dafke b'neshama k'moshe yorda lamato. That's why specifically and explicitly on neshama that when it comes down below, shayich bo is boinus hanal. Then you can apply this type of contemplation that we've been discussing only in the neshama down below. So that, as I said, the paradox is, as the neshama becomes more concealed, that's where you begin to experience even when you contemplate. Obviously, if you're subject to the concealment and you buy into it, you're not going to feel anything. But when you begin to realize, that's when you come to realize the einarech, the ayidezeh, and through this, and this is what causes take a farotzev at semoyin beyeser, this intense yearning, longing, and increased thirst. This is the ava of b'chol meidecha, the highest level of ava, higher than b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha. Just a second. B'chol meidecha, b'chinas rotzei bli gvul shebenefesh, with a infinite yearning in the soul, shu dafke b'ridus haneshama lamata, which takes place only when the neshama comes down below. Can you reach this level of b'chol meidecha? Because you need this resistance, you need this the concealment that propels the individual to reach such level of thirst and passion in his love. And just for the record, the Maimer Hamagbil Sheves, the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, which we've been discussing and we will discuss, talks about the bleak vul of B'chol Meidecha that happens dafke below, dafke neguf and nefesh habamis, and he says there that even though it's not bleak vul mamish, but because it's going outside of your comfort zone, out of your capacity, it's a B'chol Meidecha that touches the real bleak vul. Just if you want to look it up, you can see he elaborates a bit more on that. And the beer on a Magbil Shavis in the Maimon Torah from the Alter Rebbe. Okay, let me stop again. Any questions?
This is a bit theoretical, but before the Chet Eitz Hadas, when Adam Arishan was in Gan Eden, so what compelled him to want to be Mavarer, whatever I guess, I guess at least to reveal godliness, if he was in a state of godliness itself?
The same thing what propels the Aves from Atzilus to do their work. They are connected to God, and they're dedicated 24/7 doing whatever God wants of them. This is not about not being committed to the work. The question is the level of thirst and distance.
Mm-hmm.
But on the contrary, a neshama of Atzilus never sins. They're completely dveikus in Hashem. We're talking about an intensity that can only be created as a result of tremendous thirst, that can only be there when you feel absolute distance. But that's simple. Same thing, the Avis, same thing, Moshe Rabbeinu. These were dedicated servants to Hashem that halavai we should all be on that level. But there's something that's added when you don't have that level of divine revelation.
I see. Thank you.
Okay. Now let's see here. I think I should stop here because the next section. One second. Let's see something here. Yeah, I'm going to stop here because not that I just want to go slower. I don't want to go too fast here. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to stop here before the next section on page 1460. Are there any other questions? The more I read this, the more I feel the question I asked a few days ago, whether this Chirani Vinova, what he's talking about here, that the darkness brings this deeper beauty, is that connected to the distress he spoke about, Mamata Lamailo, that brings to the Helama Atzmi? The more I read it, the more I think it's not the same level. It's definitely something in common, because both of them is due to the distance, leads you to a deeper appreciation of godliness. But here, he keeps on, he's talking about an avodah of ava b'chol meidecha. You don't see, he doesn't say the word shuva, because seemingly you think, wow, that's the best example of all. About shuva is greater than a tzaddik, because he's been in a midbar. And he doesn't feel, and it was distant, and therefore his thirst is much deeper, as he says in Tanya chapter 7. The fact that he's not bringing that tells me that this is more the avodah of Mesiras Nefesh b'chol meidecha, more in the Mamayla Lamata itself, like more Navedas Tzadikim. Not completely, obviously, because we are talking about the neshama that comes down below. Just wanted to point that out. I still don't want to say anything conclusively because I want to see the whole subject matter. But it would make sense because the Rebbe Rashab definitely wants to show that you have both the Mamayla Lamata, Mamat Lamayla, you both have a Mamat Lamayla element that comes from that creates a thirst. The question is, if it's exactly the Ein Oid that we learned earlier, that comes from the ultimate distress, what we called hitting rock bottom experience. So right now, it seems like it's not that to that extent, even though it's not far away from this, because that's the next step where you really come to a place of absolute desperation, you can even say. So I want to go back also to see how he explained it back there. Just want to add, I'm just thinking out loud here. Those that are following along, great. If not, I'll explain it more later. Just trying to articulate it. Okay.
I have a question. In the notion regarding B'chol Me'odecha and the great yearning that the neshama feels here when it contemplates how far it is from Atzmus. On the one hand, I'm asking a question because I'm asking you to clarify and correct me if I'm in my understanding. But on the one hand, B'chol Me'odecha is supposed to make you feel this great longing and, in some sense, an attachment to that which you are missing. When you miss someone, then you feel, in a sense, close to them because you don't have them. There's a greater intensification of what you're lacking. On the other hand, you're isolated, and it could bring to the sense of hopelessness. So on the one hand, it brings to a great sense of yearning and a desire to return, a desire to unite with our Creator. On the other hand, it also creates a great sense of isolation and loneliness and you would think sadness. Maybe I'm just a depressive, so I focus on that, but they seem in tension with each other.
I'm not sure what you're saying. If somebody's thirsty, the thirst on one hand is a thirst that's coming from lack, and they're thirsting to be able to get water. Are you asking me if that's painful or enjoyable?
No, I guess I'm not.
Distance creates a yearning and longing. That's simply put.
Yes, it's very simply put. But B'chol Me'odecha isn't
B'chol
isn't
Meidecha is just an
makes.
expression of this profound yearning. It's B'chol Meidecha, like a very intense level of ava that can only be triggered from distance. That's what he's saying.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to stop here. As I said, top of page 1460. And